Hello, I'm Justin Beatty. I'm Manager of Peer Supports with Indiana Addictions Issues Coalition. I'm also Project Manager for Indiana Association of Peer Recovery Support Services, more commonly referred to as IPRS. Today we're going to learn a little bit about peer recovery support services and why they're an evidence-based complementary piece to a person's personal pathway of recovery. So some of the things we hope you're going to get out of this is that you're going to familiarize yourself with who peer recovery support professionals are. We're going to hope you learn the peer recovery support scope of practice and the ethical dimensions they follow as part of the work they do. We want to identify how peer recovery support professionals support recovery and how a person moves forward, and then also provide access to integrating peers into our workforce and recovery efforts in our communities. So first, let's start out by looking at who peer workers are. Peer workers are someone who's been successful in their recovery process. They've also went through some type of training and credentialing process to ensure that they're not just using their lived experience as part of what they're doing. It's also that they have education around the skills that are necessary to move a person's recovery process forward in the path that that person would like to take. One of the things when we're looking at peer workers, as I mentioned earlier, is that they're successful in the recovery process. This isn't just that they have a diagnosis of substance use or mental health or any other types of trauma-informed diagnosis. It's that they've actually been successful and have implemented some of the things that they're going to work with their peers on to help them move forward and sustain their recovery process. So as we talk about this, let's learn a little bit more about what peer workers actually do. So when we look at this, the first thing we want to talk about is their scope of practice, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what a peer is, what a peer isn't, and these kind of things. First thing we want to understand is that peers are non-clinical workers. To give a little bit more insight into what we mean by non-clinical workers, it's that a peer is not going to treat, diagnose, or stabilize a person's diagnosis. Their job is to be that complementary piece, as I mentioned, to help that person in their recovery process. And a little bit later in this video, we're going to talk about what some of those supports that peers provide are. But right now, let's make sure that we understand that the details of what a peer can do may vary depending on the organization. However, there's core competencies and ethical domains that they're going to have to follow, because we want to ensure that they're supporting a person's recovery, but they're also not trading war stories with the person. And what we mean by war stories is that their conversation is based on recovery, and it's not conversations based on using or things that went on during their symptoms of mental health concerns. So one of the first things we want to talk about is how this is the process of giving and receiving services and support for a person's long-term recovery. The goal of peer support is to help a person have recovery capital. What recovery capital is any internal or external resources that a person has available to them to help support their recovery and be able to implement that on a regular basis. Some of us may have heard it as having the correct tools in our toolbox. What's more important than having the correct tools in our toolbox is that we know which tools to use and when to use them. And one of the things we do as peers is we help the people understand these different things, and more importantly, be able to empower them to implement them in their own life. And what we want to do is, whether we're helping someone initialize, move forward, or stabilize their recovery, that we're there regularly to comfort and support them through these different scopes of practices and these different competencies we're going to talk about next. One of the first things we want to make sure we do when we provide this type of support is that it's recovery oriented. What we mean by this is kind of what I mentioned earlier. We're not talking about the previous choices you've made. We're talking about how you move forward in your recovery process, and really what do you need? What does recovery look like to you? A lot of people, when they've engaged in recovery in the past, they've not ever been asked, what do you want out of this? And that's one of the first things we do with this when we're having that recovery oriented approach, is we help the person see that we're going to move forward. Because a peer's job is not to help a person look at the past and figure out what's going on. That's the clinical role. And if that comes up during us providing peer recovery support, that's where a peer's job is to have those supports in place, those referrals, to be able to refer the person to help effectively remove that barrier that they've brought up for their sustained recovery. The next piece we look at when providing peer recovery support is a person-centered approach. What we mean by this is understanding that this is that person's life. This is that person's recovery journey, their recovery plan. So when a peer sits down with someone, they're going to have a conversation about what are your goals? What do you want to do? How does this look like to you? Have you done it before? If you have, what worked? What didn't work? All these different kinds of things, so that person actually has buy-in to this. Because a lot of us that have substance use issues or mental health concerns, this isn't our first go-round with recovery. We've several times been engaged and we know what doesn't work for us. However, a lot of times we haven't been asked. We get told, just do this. And I know myself personally and several others, we don't do well when we're told what to do. But when someone actually sits down with us, we're kind of in shock when someone asks us, what do you want out of this? What do you see happening? Do you even know what recovery is? When we have that person-centered approach and that person actually having conversations with us, we're going to have a little more buy-in. Because the reality is even when we're meeting with someone regularly, we're maybe at the most meeting with them 1% of their total week. And there's another 99% where that person has to be empowered to implement whatever we talked about during that small bit of time we have of their life. So when they actually have buy-in to it, that's when they're going to start implementing these supports. That's when they're going to start implementing these actions that we'd help teach them on. The next thing we look at is the idea that peer support is voluntary. What we mean by voluntary is that the person has buy-in. They actually want to be involved. Yes, they may have been ordered by a court, by a treatment provider. They may have been, for lack of better wording, ordered by someone in their family, have kind of given them the ultimatum idea. But what we do as peer support is we help the person understand that we do have choices, and that we have a choice to be here, that it's really awesome that you've shown up, that you've decided, hey, I don't know what I need, but I know what's currently working isn't going to happen. So let's move forward from this. And that's where we help that person see that they're volunteering to do this. It's their idea, let's move forward. And that kind of starts that paradigm shift in the person's head of that recovery focused, where they're kind of like, hey, I kind of have a say in this. I kind of have a little bit of buy-in. I'm not sure if this is going to work, but the only way I'm going to find out is if I actually try it. The next piece we look at is a relationship focused. A lot of times clinical situations, they practice detachment. And what peers do, we try to minimize the distance between that. One thing we educate our peers on through the training and credentialing process is the understanding there's a big difference between friends with someone and being friendly. And so through the training process and the credentialing process of peers, we make sure as they understand as part of their role and their ethical duty is that they can be friendly to someone, but they're not friends. But that peer role is part of that. It makes sure we have that relationship where that person feels they can have an open and honest dialogue with us, where it's going to be a judgment-free zone. And a lot of that has to do with the lived experience peers have. Because having that lived experience, we can really know how to effectively use our story to support that person. And what I mean by support that person is a lot of times those of us with substance use issues or mental health concerns, first barrier we put up is, you don't understand. You haven't been through this. Well, when a peer's been trained and credentialed, they've had training to how to share their recovery story in a way that shares hope, shares optimism that recovery is possible. And they're able to provide that living example with that person that, hey, I've done this. Here's what recovery looks like. Here's what successful recovery looks like to me. How do you want this? How do you want to move forward? What are the things you want in your life? And so when we create that relationship, when peaks come up, when valleys happen, that person's going to be more open and honest with us. They're going to really have a conversation with us and kind of just be like, hey, I don't think this is working. Because when we're friendly with them and have that relationship built focused with them, they're going to talk to us. They want to open up because they see that we're just there to support them and not tell them what to do. The next piece is making sure we're trauma informed. What we mean by this is that we understand as peers and in the services we provide that majority of the populations we deal with have been through some type of trauma. And that may greatly impact whether they want to engage in services, whether they feel recovery is possible for them. And this trauma and lack of dealing with it and getting it processed correctly may be a continued barrier to their recovery. So we do have some trauma-informed training that peers have available for them to take. And as part of this, they learn through this process and even the regular training and the credentialing process that it's not our job as peers to help a person process the trauma. Our job is when that comes up or needs to be talked about, again, We have those successful partnerships, whether it's in our organization, whether it's in our community, so when we can refer them to the person to talk to help them deal with those previous traumas or the current traumas they're dealing with. Because the studies show that unless we deal with that trauma, that's going to be a continued barrier to recovery. And our job as peer supports is to remove that barrier that's going to keep them from getting their successful recovery of what they feel it is. So one of the things we want to look at next is that peers engage in collaborative and caring relationships. So what do we mean by this? Peers are going to talk to other peers. Peers are going to reach out. They're going to say, hey, you're engaged in services. Would you be interested in talking? What do you need? These kind of things. We're going to actually listen to them. We're going to sit there for a while. We're going to let them talk. One of the things we talk about through the credentialing process and also the trainings is that it's not a peer's job to move things forward in a conversation. It's not their job to dictate the conversation. Their job is to listen, use active listening skills, and then as appropriate, use skills such as motivational interviewing to help lead the person towards achieving whatever goals they have. We reach out to engage the peers we're working with as a whole continuum of the recovery process. And what I mean by this is that a lot of times people are only engaged with treatment. And treatment's job is to identify, diagnose, and stabilize. Well, once we've stabilized someone in their recovery, hopefully if they're going to continue in recovery, they got a lot of years ahead of them. So what's going on? What are they going to do to continue to support that recovery? Because we can't be in treatment forever. Treatment is an incredibly vital part of a lot of people's recovery process. However, we can't be in treatment forever. Peer supports can effectively help that continuum of care and help that person throughout their recovery process as they engage and move towards utilizing their natural recovery supports that the peer is going to help them identify and engage. And another part of this is we show genuine acceptance and respect for the person. Because as a person with lived experience of substance use and/or mental health concerns, we truly understand. Again, I mentioned earlier how that barrier is put up a lot of times of you don't understand. You're only here for a paycheck. This is what you've learned in a book. Those are all vital things, learning something in a book, being here to provide support. But again, where we can effectively use our story, show that we care, listen, help that person meet their goals, they start to realize we respect them. And that's a key part of the recovery process because most of us, regardless of which diagnosis we have, we don't feel respected by family members. We don't feel respected by society. We probably do not have a good positive self-image. So when engaging as part of this with a peer, when we have that genuine respect for a person, we have that genuine caring, we start to build them up a little bit. And that's what we're really working towards in this, is empowering that person to move forward on their own. Another thing we look at is understanding the peer's experience and feelings. As again, a person with lived experience, we maybe can relate to some of this stuff. You know, we can relate to maybe if they've been experiencing homelessness and that's something we have. Or we can relate to the idea of our families not wanting us around. We can relate to locking ourselves in the room in the middle of a crisis. Whatever it may be, we understand and can relate to it. And that person really sees that, hey, I'm not alone. Because it's rare for someone, regardless of their diagnosis, to really think they're the only person with it. But a lot of times that's how they feel because they haven't been around other people that are successful in recovery. And when they're engaging with a peer, they have that sitting right in front of them of, hey, this is successful recovery. This person's been through this. Hey, I got a little hope. I got a little optimism that maybe I can do this. So when we look at this next thing, you keep hearing me mention the word support. That's one of the main things peers do is we provide that support. We validate that peer's experience and feelings. One of the things we don't do is minimize or try to relate something we've been through to them. If we haven't been through it, we're going to be honest. We're going to say, I can't imagine how that feels. Is that something you want to talk about? We're not going to try to relate our own experience to theirs. Now, as part of it, we may be able to share that, hey, I understand what it's like to be sad. I understand what it's like to feel disconnected to the community. But we're not going to say, hey, I've been through this and I know it's just like that. The next thing we're going to do is help encourage the person to explore their community roles. What are you doing to be actively involved? What does actively involved in your community and your life look like to you? Because it doesn't look the same to everyone. And one of the things we try to get the peers to make sure they understand is that it's that person's life, it's that person's recovery plan. If engaging in the community is just sitting on their front porch a couple times a week, then great. Do you have a chair to sit there? Is it comfortable? What times do you want to sit down? Some people want to go volunteer at Little League. Some people just want to go to the park. Some people want to help clean up trash. Whatever that looks like to them, let's help you achieve it. Next thing we do is we convey hope to the person about their own recovery. That yes, I am successful in my recovery process as a peer support provider, but let's talk about yours. Let's see what type of hope you have for your recovery process. Let's see what you feel like moving forward and what pieces you feel we need to put in place to help you move forward. The next thing we do is we're going to celebrate a person's efforts and accomplishments. A lot of times in society, we only celebrate accomplishments and do not look at the efforts. Or maybe if we celebrate an effort, it's followed up by but, and a lot of people don't engage well with that. So we're going to celebrate just the effort. You showed up to your appointment today, but I was 15 minutes late, but you still showed up. You're starting to do some of this stuff. Well, I didn't do it the amount of times you told me to. That doesn't matter. It wasn't me telling you to do something so many times. You set a goal of trying to go out on the porch 5 times. You only did it 3. That's more than you've ever done it before. We're going to celebrate the efforts and again, help continue to build that person's self-esteem and that respect they have for themselves by showing them we appreciate their respect. We appreciate their efforts. The next thing we're going to do is provide that assistance to helping them reach their goals. And what I mean by that is we're not going to do anything for them. Part of peer support is empowering a person, helping them truly understand that they can do this if they want to, and that we can provide some of the resources in place. So when we provide that concrete assistance, we're going to help remove those barriers to that person's sustained recovery by providing the resources, providing the education that that person needs to implement into their life. So when we look at the next part, it's incredibly important that peers utilize their lived experience in the correct and ethical ways. And what I mean by that, we're going to share our lived experience of recovery. We're not going to share our lived experience of the active traumas that were caused by our diagnosis. And what I mean by that, we're going to relate our own recovery stories as appropriate to what's going on with the person. It's not our job to validate our lived experience and prove to the person that we have this diagnosis or this and that. The whole point of sharing with a person our story, once they've given us permission, is that here's some hope, here's some optimism, here's some examples of how I've implemented positive change in my life. And that's what this whole process of giving peer support is about, is positive change, positive growth of what that person wants to do. And that goes back to, again, where I talked about celebrating any efforts done by the person. We're going to discuss ongoing personal efforts that the person's doing to enhance their health, their wellness, and their recovery. We're going to help them look at it. We're going to help them evaluate it. What's working? What's not working? What do you want to do next? It's not me saying, hey, this isn't working. You need to do this. No, it's what do you feel are some strengths? What do you feel are some improvements? What would you like to do about that? The next thing we're going to do is recognize when to use our story and to share it as appropriate. And the key word there is when it's appropriate. We don't need to keep interjecting, oh, I've done that or I've done this. The whole point of sharing our lived experience of recovery is to support the person's recovery process. And again, it's about that person, not us. The other thing we do with our story is we describe personal recovery practices, maybe some things we've implemented to help us move forward in our recovery, to help that person see again the hope and optimism that recovery is possible. Because a peer being able to share their lived experience is vital to the peer doing the role correctly. We have to ensure that peers are trained, educated, and understand the ethical ways to share their lived stories of recovery, but however, it has to be a piece of a peer's role when they're providing peer recovery support services. So when we look at this next, we're going to personalize the support we provide. And what I mean by personalize it is that no two people are the same. No two people's recovery process are the same. And what I mean by this is we're going to talk to the person. We're going to find out, what do you need? What's worked? What's not worked? And we're going to understand as part of that my personal values as a peer, my personal biases, and understand how to set my personal opinions, my personal bias to the side, because it's about this person. It's about what they want. It's about them moving forward with their recovery goals. And that's why, as part of this, dialogue is so incredibly important, and that active listening skill of being able to sit there and listen to a person, not interject, not interrupt, actually listen to the person and let them share with us their experiences. Because that person we're working with, that peer we're working with, they're the subject matter expert on their life. They're the one continuous piece through everything that's went on. So let's have a talk with them. Let's understand and let's appreciate and respect that person and their experiences and help validate them and use their previous experience and choices to help them create their personal recovery plan moving forward. And we're going to tailor those services that we provide to what their needs are. Because again, with a person-centered approach, it's all about the person we're providing services for. So we're going to support this person in their recovery planning. What are your goals? What do you want to do? We may at times have to help them identify what that is and understand that there may be steps to get to this goal, and help that person understand that recovery is a process. It's not an end game. It's something we're going to continue to move forward with, and some stuff we thought would work when we first started talking about these goals may not work now. It's that person's plan. We can change it, tailor it whenever that person wants to. And that's one of the things we want to empower the person to do, is recognize when things are going well, how do we keep them going? When things maybe need a little adjustment, how do we adjust them? And that's where, as they continue to transition to more utilizing those natural community recovery supports, they're going to understand how to do this in their own personal life and be able to implement it. And that's when they're going to continue with that successful, sustained recovery. So we look at this in ways where we're going to be able to link the person to resources, services, and support. As part of this recovery planning, as part of this recovery process, barriers to recovery are going to come up. And it's our job as peer recovery support to assist a person with identifying their barriers, but equally, if not more important, is provide that linkage to resource, supports, services to help remove those barriers. So what we do through that is we make sure we have community partnerships. We make sure the peers have the ability to visit organizations, know what's really going on. Because a lot of us, we've been given a resource list before and told, go to this place. Well, we hope the place is still open. It's still scary to go get these supports. So when a peer has the ability of their role to really get educated on resources, visit the resource, know who works there, have conversations with the resources, they're able to educate the person they're providing services to of what to expect when they engage. And that's vital. A person is more likely to engage in services when they know what to expect and have an idea of the process, who they're going to talk to, and these kind of things. A lot of times you'll hear the term warm handoff. What the whole point of a warm handoff is that comfort, that the person feels supported. They feel they really know what's going on. It's not just a piece of paper. And that's where peers can really help not just a person's recovery process, they can help organizations and communities by being this resource broker and being able to have this understanding of everything that's going on and providing those effective linkage to resources, supports, and services that that person needs to continue to move forward. Another piece of this is we're going to provide information and skills related to the health, wellness, and recovery of that person. A lot of times those of us with certain diagnosis, or really any diagnosis, we've put our health to the side. We've not thought about these different things. So that's where we help the person recognize, maybe that ache you're having really isn't from this. Maybe it's something you might want to go to the doctor about. We're going to talk to that person, and as part of that relationship, we're going to have this support from the person of understanding that we're just here to help. We're not telling you what to do. We're just trying to lay a little foundation and help you move forward. So we're going to help you look at all these different things. We're going to help you and coach you in some desired skills you want. Maybe some resources you want to be involved with. We're going to also, as part of this, with the peer we're working with's permission, educate the family. Because as we look at recovery, it's the community, it's the family, it's all those different pieces that we need to focus on as the person moves forward. So once we have the person's permission to be able to educate the family on recovery, maybe what's going on with the person, we want to make sure as appropriate we include every person that's involved in that person's life. And that's where the peer can really help to make sure everybody's on the same page. There's some accountability and that the person knows they're starting to work towards maybe building trust back. So when we look at this, crisis may come up. When crisis come up with a peer that a peer recovery support is working with, that peer has received training and education how to successfully de-escalate the crisis and make an appropriate referral as necessary. Again, I talked about how peers are not clinical workers. It's not our job to help someone process crisis situations. However, we can't just tell the person we can't talk about this. What we do is we make sure that when peers are credentialed and trained, they have an understanding of how to successfully de-escalate a crisis and refer as necessary. And it's going to happen. We make sure we reside and provide that reassurance to people. But as part of it, we're going to make sure they get connection to whoever's educated and trained to provide them the appropriate services they need. We as peers, we value communication. And what we mean by that is that I mentioned earlier in this about honest, active, two-way communication and actually having a dialogue. Again, that person we're working with, they're the subject matter expert. Let's learn from them. Let's treat a person as a resource. Let's treat them as someone that with dignity, respect, listen to what they have to say. And as part of that, we're going to provide constructive feedback when necessary. We're going to provide some direction. We're going to provide support most of all. And as part of this, we're going to use the active listening skills I mentioned. We're going to clarify understanding of information because we want to make sure we're not using our interpretation of what a person says. We're going to make sure that we really thoroughly understand. We're going to ask a person, can you elaborate that on a little bit? Let me make sure I'm understanding where you're going. Using these different active listening skills, using different skills from motivational interviewing to make sure we really understand, because we can't effectively provide support if we don't really understand where the person's direction is and how they want to go. The other part of this with it, we're going to make sure as part of this communication, we document information as our organization or community support provides, and make sure that we understand what's moving forward and that everybody within the process of this person's recovery is on the same page, whether it's within our community, whether it's within our organization. Now, as part of this, we make sure the peers thoroughly understand applicable laws. And so they understand who, when, and where they're allowed to share information with. We're going to promote leadership and advocacy for that person as part of their recovery. We're going to use that knowledge I talked about of relevant rights and laws such as HIPAA, ADA, Olmstead, any of these things to make sure that, one, we're doing things ethically and within the confines of the scope of practice we have, and also applicable laws, but also too that the person in recovery understands their rights, understands their dignity. Another thing we're going to do is help that person advocate for themselves and when necessary, advocate on their behalf with different referral sources within our own organization, wherever those advocacy pieces are needed. We're going to help educate that person and do our best to empower them to advocate for themselves. However, sometimes that's not possible. So our role as peer recovery support is to advocate on behalf of the person whenever necessary. Another thing is we're going to use knowledge of our legal resources and advocacy organizations to help that person build an advocacy plan. If they have some barriers around the legal system, do we have the appropriate referrals to refer them to help minimize them or remove them when possible? If there's maybe some other stuff going on, who can they talk to? Because there's advocacy organizations everywhere that'll be able to help that person, but a lot of times they don't know or are not comfortable to engaging, and that's where we're going to help that person engage, understand, and advocate for themselves as part of that empowerment piece I keep talking about. The other thing, we're going to help that person participate in efforts to eliminate anything else that's going on that maybe feels they're not respected. We understand overall that this may not be possible depending on the situation, but we're going to empower the person as much as possible to do what they can do to move forward in their recovery process. Because again, when we're using this person-centered, strength-based approach to this person's recovery plan, it's about them and what they want to see as the outcomes. So we're going to look at this continued as part of this leadership and advocacy piece is we're going to actively participate in efforts within our organization. We as the peer recovery supports are going to continue to be involved. We're going to help our organization understand what peers are. We're going to help understand how to effectively use them and when and where it's appropriate for peer recovery supports to be provided, and also know when our limits have been reached and we need to make that successful referral to someone else. Other piece of it, we're going to do our best to maintain a positive image of the peer recovery support profession and as what recovery looks like. We're going to promote growth and development within the person. As part of this recovery plan and this recovery process that's person-centered, I mentioned about how we can evaluate stuff as it goes. We want that person to understand just because we set a goal doesn't mean it can't be tweaked, it can't be pushed to the side depending on life circumstances. Because life happens and life happens fast a lot of times. And a lot of times people with diagnosis, they're not the best at dealing with life when it happens. So when we're there to provide that support, we're letting them understand that maybe this is a growth process. Maybe this is part of your development, and that any positive change is what we're working towards, and successful recovery involves that aspect and that mentality of any positive change. Not an end game that it has to be this, of any positive change necessary. As another piece of this, we're going to seek opportunities to increase knowledge and skills around the person. We're going to help them look at things and say, how are you moving forward with this? Do you think of anything that could maybe benefit you more? How can I assist you with that? Again, we're not going to do it for the person, but we're going to make sure they have the supports in place to be able to do it. One of the things as we talk about these roles and these core competencies is we ensure throughout the training and credentialing process of peers that they understand there's a stern ethical responsibility that they need to uphold. And that involves things like boundary management and these things we're going to talk about in a minute. Because it's important for peers to understand that their personal recovery is not their professional recovery. And maybe those opinions and bias they have in their personal recovery, they're going to have to be set aside in the professional services. Because when we're providing that person-centered, strength-based approach, again, it's about that person, not what we feel will work for recovery. And so as part of this, one of the things we look at is that the primary ethical goal of peer recovery support is just to prevent harm or injury to the populations we serve. We want to make sure the services we're providing are supporting that person and really helping them move forward and not in any way hindering. And so as part of this, we try to educate peers on 4 main ethical goals and responsibilities. The first one of these is, the technical term for it is iatrogenics. We don't expect people to remember specific definitions. The idea is understanding the concept. What the concept of iatrogenic domains of ethical responsibility are is that you may have had the best intentions, but is that going to potentially harm someone? Is that going to potentially hinder someone? We make sure peers through the training and credentialing process really have a firm understanding that, hey, how can this affect the populations we work with? How is this going to hinder them? You know, yes, part of our job as peers is to provide access to social supports. But at what point providing that access to social support, maybe attending a meeting with them, attending a baseball game or something along those lines, do we hinder that person's growth from connecting and building those natural community recovery supports? So we want to make sure that as we're continuing to support the person, we're not hindering them or causing them harm. The next thing we make sure peers understand is that they have a fiduciary obligation. What we mean by fiduciary obligation is that they have an assumed role. When that person comes to them, that person has some expectations. They're expecting some type of support for their recovery, and a lot of times a person doesn't know what they're going to get from peer recovery support. They just know they were told that this may help them. They were told by a treatment provider that they should go. They were told by their justice referral. They were told by their significant other, whoever it is. And a lot of times we as peers need to make sure we understand we have that role to provide peer recovery support and have a firm understanding what that role is. As the next piece, when we're talking about people with lived experience, we really want to make sure they truly understand how to set boundaries. That they understand that a lot of things that are acceptable in their personal recovery do not translate over into the professional setting. And what I mean, for example, is that a lot of people in recovery, their job is to support. They'll answer the phone at 2 a.m. They'll drop what they're doing to go support someone. We help make sure peers truly understand that your job is to help the person you're providing services to find that person that's going to drop everything and help them. Find that person that's going to answer the phone at 2 a.m. But that's not the peer recovery role. The peer recovery role is to stay within the boundaries of our organization, to work within the hours of operation, to make sure that person we're providing services understands that I will work with you, I will do my best to support you, but you're not the only person I'm working with. You're not the only person on my caseload. I'm going to have times where I can't talk to you. I'm going to have times where it may take me a while to get back to you. We can't be friends. We can't hang out in a social role. We can't be friends on social media. I can provide you services. We can be friendly, but my goal is to help you connect with all these people in the recovery community that can be these friends, can be these allies. And it's incredibly important that the peer understands that to keep that effective boundary management. Another part of this boundary management is the ability of peers to be community-based. Is that it's vital for a peer, if we're going to meet someone where they're at in their recovery process, that we also have the ability to meet someone where they physically are. Transportation is a huge barrier for people to engage in recovery and services. And with peers being community-based, and having that little bit of boundary difference than a lot of clinical or other roles, it allows them and affords them the opportunity to engage with person on a more peer level. Maybe it's meeting them at their house. Maybe it's meeting them at the local coffee shop. Maybe it's meeting them at the park. But it's meeting them where they would meet their peers more than likely. It's that community-based approach to help that person engage more regularly rather than having to come to a brick and mortar location and only have a conversation in an office. The other part is we make sure peers understand how their actions can affect not just them, not just the person they're providing services for, but also how it affects the community, how it affects the organization, how it affects recovery and people's views of recovery, how it affects how people view the peer recovery support profession. So we help them make sure they understand how their actions can affect multi-parties across the spectrum, and that it's not just them, and really start to weigh those kind of things. Because when someone has ineffective boundary management, it can affect the other peers in the organization. It can give people the wrong outlook on what peer recovery support is. So when we make sure they understand these ethical ideas I just talked about, it really helps us have a better understanding and better confidence in this role, that it's going to be providing effective and ethical peer recovery support services, and they understand that the peer recovery role is not providing personal recovery support. So when we look at this, one of the things we've talked about the linkage to resources, we've talked about providing support, providing services. Peer support is founded on the idea of any positive change. And what I mean by this is, how do we help a person move forward? How do we help them better understand what they want out of life? How do we help them, once they have an idea of what they want out of life, how do you get this? How do we continue to move forward? Because it's a lot easier to take 2 steps than it is to walk 10 miles. Even if the goal is to walk 10 miles, let's talk about it in 2 or 5 step increments. Because if we start talking about walking 10 miles, I'm already overwhelmed. But when we talk about putting all these pieces in place of how to get to the end of the goal, Let's work on that. And that's where we start celebrating the efforts, celebrating every accomplishment. One of the main roles of peer support is to be a cheerleader for that person, to be an advocate for that person and help them evaluate their life, their recovery process, and what they want to implement. And that starts with any positive change. And what I mean again by that is helping that person look at what are commonly referred to as the social determinants of health. What the social determinants are of health, without getting too deep into it, is the idea that there's 5 domains that someone needs support in to help have a holistic approach to being that wellness, that health, that advocacy piece. And so peers really look at these social determinants of health and help provide access to support to these where maybe someone's lacking, or even if they're not lacking in it, maybe where they want to have some improvement. So when we look at this, the first one we want to talk about is, what's the person's economic stability? Are they employed? Is it gainful employment? Is that employment going to help them reach their goals? The peer is going to provide access to resources and support necessary to help that person meet whatever their employment goals are. Is there food insecurity? A lot of times when we hear the term food insecurity, our first thought is, oh, well, they don't have any food. A lot of times food insecurity is, I don't know if the food's going to last all the way to the next paycheck. All my bills are due on this next paycheck, so I don't know if I'm going to have enough to get food for the whole entire week. So we help that person understand and effectively try to remove that barrier by referral to resources. Do they need some type of assistance to get food? And if they do, what assistance are they interested in? And then how do we actively help them engage in it and the appropriate referrals? We help them look at their housing instability. Do you have a safe place to lay your head? If you do, how safe is it? Do you know you're going to be able to stay there a while? Because we know a lot of us enjoy going home and laying in our bed. A lot of us have our favorite pillow. A lot of us have our favorite blanket. Just those tiny little securities, those tiny little supports can mean so much for someone that maybe has been couch surfing, bouncing around between people's houses, not knowing how long till the person tells them they can't stay there anymore. Another thing with this is helping that person understand that there's steps to finding stable housing sometimes. And recovery residences are great. They're not available for everyone. They're not available in every area. So we have to look at the full spectrum of what safe housing and available safe housing looks like for the person we're providing services for. And not just tell them what options we think they need, but what is realistic housing for the person. When we look at this next piece, we want to talk to them a little bit about their education. One of the things we look at and talk about regularly throughout the community and stuff is early childhood education and development. One of the things a lot of people don't recognize, and I firmly believe in this, is that substance use and a lot of mental health stuff, it's cyclical. It's due to our genes, it's due to the environments we're in. So when we're effectively providing support to a parent, this may be considered a prevention technique for the children. It's going to support the children. It's going to help them get better access to school in the morning because mom or dad or whoever their caretaker is actually up, is maybe packing them a lunch, is engaged, helping them do their homework. As part of this, a lot of people with diagnosis have stopped going to school for whatever reason, maybe not completed high school. So is that a barrier to you? A lot of our employment opportunities out there throughout the state and throughout the nation require a high school diploma or the equivalent. So how do we help a person get that if that's what they want? If they keep talking, as part of the piece we just mentioned, finding gainful employment, what pieces do you need to get gainful employment? What pieces do you need to move up at where you're working? If one of them ends up being completing their high school education, how do we provide the resources necessary for that? Maybe the person's completed their high school education, however, they maybe have a little bit of interest in, I don't know, I've always thought about maybe going to college and getting a degree. That's great. How do we provide you access? Because it can be overwhelming when we first start looking at a website for a college and see all this stuff of so many credit hours. I got to have a book rental. I got to do this. I got to do that. So we're going to help the person understand it and help them get engaged with services through whatever higher education they want so they can actually talk to someone and help create an education plan. Another part of this education piece is helping the person with their literacy. Some people don't want to admit they read on a third grade level. Some people don't want to admit they read at all. So we're going to talk and help provide that support. Are they interested if they're illiterate? Can they get involved in something? If they have a third grade reading level, do you understand services that are being provided to you, the literature that's being provided to you? If not, let's make sure you understand what's going on, and let's figure out a way to move forward from this to make sure you really have an idea of what's being talked to you about. The next thing we look at with this is the social and community context, because it's been said several times that isolation is one of the key pieces of active diagnosis, and that connection is one of the key pieces to active recovery. So we want to help that person find what that connection piece is for them. Is this community participation? What are you getting out there doing? And like I said, it looks different for every person. I mentioned that earlier, that what do you want to do? What's realistic for you? Because it's not realistic for everybody to start going to all the neighborhood meetings, to start going here and there. They may want to do different things, and that's great. How do we do it? You may want to get actively involved in your child's PTA. How do we do that? Are there potential barriers? How do we move forward? How do we advocate for you to get back in your child's life and be an active participant? That's where we help that person identify what they want to do as their social and community context and help them look at it and how to move forward. The next thing we want to look at with the person is what's going on with their health and healthcare. Do they have access to healthcare? If you do you have access to primary care? If you don't have access to healthcare, how are we going to get you healthcare? Because a lot of people think, oh, well, I just can't get it. Let's get you connected with the resources out there that are really educated on healthcare, and it can help you figure out where, when, and how you can connect. And then once we get that healthcare piece in place, or if it's already in place, do you have an active relationship with a primary care doctor? Have you went to the dentist recently? Because one of the things we understand is that we got to continue to take care of ourselves. We need regular maintenance. And a lot of us in our active diagnosis, we've not had that care for ourselves. We've not had that respect. We've not taken care of ourselves the way we should to make sure that we're not going to have those aches and pains at 35 we maybe shouldn't be having until 50. And so that's where we help them make sure they understand as part of this, though, that we're here if they need to talk about what their primary care or someone else talked to them about. Because again, in the previous comments, we talked about how maybe they really don't understand. And it can be embarrassing for a lot of us to say, hey, I know you just explained all this to me, but I don't have a clue what you just said. And so we want to make sure that they know we're here to support them so they can come back and talk to us. We can maybe advocate on their behalf. If we need to go talk to the doctor with them, we will. But we're not going to provide them information and try to decipher what their doctor told them. We're going to connect them to the resources available so they can really understand, or encourage them to, more importantly, re-engage with whoever provided them that information and ask for a more clear understanding. The other pieces of this is looking at the neighborhood and the built environments for them. And what I mean by this is, does the person have access to the foods that support healthy living habits? Do they have to shop at the gas station? Is the Dollar Tree the only place to get food? Are they always getting food at fast food? If they are, how do we find supports for them so they can maybe start beginning to create more healthy eating habits? Do they live in an area where crime and violence is rampant? If so, we talked about that safe living environment. Is it a safe living environment for them? Is it a place they're comfortable? Or are they scared to leave their house because they're going to go by people they used to engage with? They're scared they're going to get robbed, whatever it may be. So we help them identify as part of their neighborhood, if crime and violence is an issue, what they would like to see happen moving forward. We look at the environmental conditions around them and their quality of housing. We mentioned the housing piece earlier, and I want to elaborate on that a little bit. It's the whole idea of you have a safe, stable place to go home. You know where you're going home to at night. You know that when you get home, you're not going to be asked to leave because you've overstayed your welcome. You have your own stuff. You maybe have a drawer or a closet where you can put your stuff up at. You're not living out of a suitcase or a trash bag or anything like that. You have a place you call home. So looking at this, what we've talked about through all this is about peer supports. We've gave you a little education on what they do. We've gave you a little bit on that ethical responsibility they follow. The next thing we want to talk about is, we've talked about these theories and such, but are peers effective? Does this really work? And if it does work, how? As I mentioned earlier, a lot of us, the first barrier we put up when we're even thinking about recovery is that no one understands. No one's been through this. I'm alone. And so when we actually take a chance to engage in services, we're already doubtful. We're already questioning whether or not this is going to work, whether or not this person we know what we talks about. So when we engage with that peer recovery support, and they have self-disclosed to us that they're a person in long-term recovery or whatever terminology they use to describe their personal recovery, we understand this is an ally. We're like, hey, wait, this might be someone like me. This might be someone I can talk to that maybe understands what I'm going through. And it's not always going to just remove that barrier, but it might move it down a little bit to where we can really, at that point, kind of start getting some of that information, that support and those services, kind of get it to start kind of resonating in their head and starting to kind of see what's going on. So when we look at this, we want to understand that peers are a complementary piece to a person's recovery process. As I mentioned, peers are not clinical. We don't treat, we diagnose, we don't stabilize a person. However, we provide access and support to those social determinants of health I've mentioned that is proven to be necessary for a person to be supported in their life and feel safe. So when we look at this, there's been several studies around peers. In 2017, O'Connell and Attell, what they did is they did a study. This study was based on the idea that people who received peer support had 15 fewer drinking days in a standard care group at the 9-month mark of the study. So when we think about this study and think about it in the idea of a 30-day month, people that received peer support had a 50% reduction in the days they drank. Now, when we have this idea, you kept hearing me say a positive change, notice nowhere in here does it say they didn't drink at all. Because when peer supports look at that idea of positive change, and it's not specifically based on an abstinence mentality, positive change is fewer drinking days. 15 fewer drinking days. 50% reduction. That's huge due to having that peer support. Another thing we look at with a lot of these studies is that with peers, they're going to help that person. Studies are everywhere. Basic Google searches will help you find them. All these different things will help you find studies available about peers. Every single one will tell you that peer recovery works. It helps a person. It's that complementary piece to the recovery process and how a person moves forward. Whether it's veterans, whether it's people who are currently or previously incarcerated, whether it's people with mental health diagnosis, whether it's people with substance use diagnosis, whether it's co-occurring, whether it's people with trauma. Peers have been used for a long time. And as we move this profession forward, it's giving people more regular access to peer support and someone being able to use their lived experience that's similar to that other person to really help support them throughout this. So when we look at this, understand that that lived experience is a vital piece to help begin removing barriers for a person. And we want to truly understand through this that peers are necessary. Peer recovery supports are needed throughout our communities. They're needed in our organizations.